Okay, thank you. My wife, when I told her I was coming here today, she said, well, who's going to get up at 10 a.m. to listen to you? And she's probably quite right. So I'm grateful the audience is here. I came by train and sort of finished off my PowerPoints en route. They're not that exciting. I'm afraid they're quite blank. I previously used to be a director of one of the HEA subject centres many years ago. It was probably nearly a decade ago. I've still got some of the scars with that. If anyone wants to reminisce about those days, happy to do that. But I'm delighted to be able to talk about the Teff. I gather you've had some quite high impact people giving conversations, and I've had a cup of coffee, but whether that's going to be enough to give you the level of energy that I'm supposed to do in these things, I don't know. I gather there's Twitter kicking on, and I have got a Twitter account, sort of intermittent user of that more than anything else. Obviously, I don't want to go too much into the details of the background of the Teff, because you're probably sick to death. They've got plenty of views on that. But I mean, what I found interesting from, I suppose, a personal perspective was the way in which the Teff process unfolded. I am fortunate to come from a university which has got a gold rating, so I can speak now about the confidence of our quality of our education, and etc., etc. And I know there'll be probably plenty of cynics in the audience here about all of those rankings. I suppose my own personal journey on the Teff, I applied, like maybe other people in this room, to be a Teff assessor, and I got an email telling me that I was successful. I was appointed to be a Teff assessor. It was actually the day after, when I'd just been told I had been rejected for a job, so to some extent they came at nice times, you know, sort of good news, bad news to some extent. And I went to the training, which was part of it. I don't know if any other people were Teff assessors in the room. Okay, so I can speak quite candidly about that then. So I went to the training, this time in Birmingham, which is probably about January. And what was interesting from that exercise was the way in which it sort of unfolded. So you got given some homework beforehand, which then you were told you were going to be rated on how well you did it. And you got divided into sort of tables. And on tables of 8 or 10, so on my table, I think there was a Vice-Chancellor, a couple of Pro-Vice-Chancellors, a Deputy Vice-Chancellor, student, and myself. And then you got given notes to write on and flip charts. And the first thing I learned there was that Vice-Chancellors, Deputy Vice-Chancellors, and Pro-Vice-Chancellors never like to take any notes. They obviously are very good at delegating, and they delegated that to the student and myself. So I instantly knew what position I had in terms of hierarchy. So you could put hashtag leadership moment on that. But what was clear in terms of that process was wild divisions, really, between panels on competing paperwork. It reminded me back in the day when I was just like trying to get a job, you know, after my undergraduate degree. You know, I had the misfortune of going to, I think it was Midland Bank Training Centre, and we all got given these pieces of paperwork to work on. They're all the same, but it depended on the forcefulness of arguments. You've probably been there around the table, done things like that. It was a ghastly affair. I was so glad I didn't get that job either. But what was interesting was the way in which different tables came to different opinions. And some tables went clearly just on the metrics route, and other tables were more swayed by the provider statements. And I think that really that's what we've seen in the way the Teff ratings have come out. To some extent, the provider statements have had greater impact than probably people initially thought. And that, to some extent, you know, is evidenced by the way in which some institutions have gone from being previously viewed as being sort of a silver into a gold, or a bronze into a silver, or in the case of one institution, I think from a silver back to a bronze, which I won't mention. But I think for me personally, I was also in my university involved in their own Teff submission, and that was quite an extensive process. And I think that the issue with that, I should have actually clicked on, shouldn't I, because I'm kind of talking. The issue with that was that it was a great more deal of paperwork than probably any of us really thought about, and probably I think what the government had thought about at the time. And I think that when we look at the outcomes of the Teff, The issue that many of us dealt with was trying to get the evidence, trying to find where the evidence lay. And to some extent that reminded me of previous sort of, when we went through the ref impact case statements, when people were saying, but yeah, I know that's really good. And you're like, well, where's the impact? And people were sort of saying, ooh, can I get a letter from someone? It's not quite back in the days of the QAA audits when you could write the letters yourself and put them into the box files and sort of put a coffee stain on it. And that obviously didn't happen at Coventry University when I was there. But the point that I'm really saying is that from my perspective, at least, there was a difficulty at times in trying to find some of that evidence. I think that when we look at the provider statements, we see quite a variety, apart from the fact it takes a long time to get into the website to actually download them. I don't know if anyone's had that difficulty as well. Have many of you looked at those statements or compared them? And they range from, I think, a couple of pages through to quite extensive ones, some that are really quite well proofread and been professionally developed, through to others that appear to be more sort of copy from the prospectus. And maybe that's a resource issue, but it also I think highlights the degree of significance that some universities took to this rather than others. And I think that, generally speaking, that is a level of complexion that I think probably the government did not think universities would take in terms of Teff, the level of input and effort and hours that were involved in it. The justness of the Teff, of course, is going to rumble along for a long time, and no doubt you've probably had many debates in the bars or in coffees, etc., about that. Many universities have been critical with regard to which, for example, universities not too far from here have been critical about the extent to which, well, we've got Nobel Prizes, we've got all these sort of accolades, and yet, here we are with a silver rating. How does that work? And I think you could see that. But on the other hand, I also know that maybe they just didn't take it. Did they take it serious enough? Potentially, were they well prepared enough? It's hard to say. I'm not going to start to really unpick that, but I think the broader issue of it is that the outcomes, while we might see them being unpredictable, in many ways they were quite predictable, you could arguably say, because of the way the metrics were. We can ask questions about the nature of the metrics, of course, and there's many, many people who've discussed that at greater length than I have time to do, and we can think about the conclusions that can be drawn for them, and some of those things in terms of the impact for the social sciences. And those are the sort of things I'll try and touch on in the next 20, 30, 40 minutes. I think one of the things with this is the extent to which the outcomes can be viewed as being excellent, or a sense of excellence. The issue of the Teff is not what it tells us, in my view at least, but really what it doesn't tell us. There is, in that sense, heady debates about it. There was a special issue of something called Compass. I don't know if many people have seen that. It was on the NTFS distribution list. I haven't copied all of it in this presentation, but no. Okay. But there's a lot of challenges about that. Many people wrote about it from different perspectives. Graham Gibbs talked about it. Sally Brown talked about it. I'm not going to go back to that. I would just say if people want to sort of think about the Teff or go back to it, that's a good place to do. But the issue that I can see is that while we might see the Teff as a mark of excellence, a question needs to be raised about the extent to which the legislation sat behind it had sufficient focus on excellence in teaching. And I think here there's probably an important aspect for us as social scientists about our impact on government, about our impact on the policy process, and the extent to which we, as communities and professional associations, really got involved in all of this. And I think that's an area that we probably have not been as strong as we might have. I say that both from a personal perspective. I'm a treasurer of the Political Studies Association of the UK. We did produce a Teff kind of statement, but the extent to which we lobby on the Teff, for example, in comparison, say, our lobbying on other aspects of research funding is totally different. We've just appointed the new chief executive of the PSA, as a former deputy chief executive of the ESRC. So a good person to have, Phil Sobin. But on the other hand, he brings that research knowledge into it. And I think we have to be mindful of the extent to which our associations, which represent us, are actually able to speak from a teaching and learning perspective, which often sometimes seem to be more of an afterthought, both in terms of the organisation, the structure, the makeup, including also the finances of them. And I think that is an important issue. The Teff, I think, is also part of a broader, bigger picture of a hidden agenda on the part of government, which is about the removal of tuition fees, which is about potentially allowing the likes of Oxford and Cambridge to charge exorbitant amounts of money that people are prepared to pay, and also about the way in which many politicians see universities being rather bloated, being financially, got money, got these nice buildings, you've all got comfy chairs, you've got this sort of fab furniture, all that type of stuff. And the difficult financial pressures, of course, that universities still face, but nonetheless, I think there's a mantra that sits within government that somehow we are an area that, on one hand, we've been touched, but on the other hand, actually, we're ready for and ripe for a shake-up. And, of course, this is at a time of an expansion of significant private providers, a change to the way in which degree awarding powers can play out, and the way in which many subjects, including law, are under significant threat and change over coming years. So there's quite a lot of change taking place, and Teff, I think, is part of that. But we also have to look further afield. Don't know if anyone is familiar with the Corbyn Amendment in the United States. Is that something people have come across? So I've come from a political science background, but in the United States, there was a maverick US senator, and you know what happens in the United States every so often? They say the government's going to shut down. Well, and you have these sort of announcements, you think, well, the country doesn't stop quite running, but on the other hand, they say that because they don't have enough money, and they have to do these sort of crazy bills, etc., that the people tag on legislation to. And Senator Tom Coburn, who's a Republican from Oklahoma, got an amendment to the National Science Foundation's research bill that was tagged on to all of this sort of spending back in 2013. And that said that funding from political science research was not going to be available for political science unless the project was certified as promoting national security or the economic interests of the United States. So here you have a very direct focus of government impacting upon future research priorities for academics. Now, in the end, the Coburn Amendment, as it is known, didn't actually get implemented. In 2014, President Obama signed into the law the appropriations bill, and it was not attached to it. But over the previous year, political scientists who are putting forward research plans were mindful of what the direction of travel was, and in doing so, adjusted their proposals. And I think we have to be mindful in the context of the Teff. On the one hand, people say it's a government-certified measure, but it is also a government interference as well, potentially, and the extent to which that is part of other issues, which might be people say, what's the value of that degree? What does this do, etc. And so for 9 months, the National Science Foundation had restricted political science funding for projects that reflected the amendment views. So that will have an impact going forward in a way that is hard to identify at this moment, but I think it is worth being aware of that. I mention that not necessarily to be a spreader of doom and gloom, although I'm from Scotland, of course, which, but at the same time, I think it's important to raise the debate. It's to raise the debate about what we as social scientists say, what we do, what our professional bodies do, and how we actually respond to that and to defend our interests. And I think, generally speaking, we have somewhat been negligent as a community on many of these fronts. We've sort of got involved, there's many, many more people involved in teaching and learning, but the extent to which we're influencing and shaping debates, I think we're often more in reaction modes rather than anything else. So I think this requires us as social scientists to raise important issues, such as social value, social capital, as part of the degree programme. Many of these things, to some extent, are overlooked when we look at Teff. And of course, students will increasingly make choices on the basis of Teff rankings, but the extent to which students can make informed choices is dependent upon their background, their families, the extent to which those supporting mechanisms are fully mobilised, are able to make sort of a broader holistic issue, rather than just saying that's gold, it's obviously good, And I think that's a temptation. I'm not questioning, clearly, gold, silver and bronze. My university has got gold. But I think at the same time we have to question the extent to which people will make decisions behind that. And that's a bigger and broader issue, which I think there will be unintended consequences from. And looking at those issues, for example, don't know if anyone, when they're looking for a bit more entertainment, or just now, you know, saying what's happening on BBC News rather than maybe listening to me, but at the same time, look at the Campaign for Social Sciences website, and you look at that, and I get the bulletins from it. It's pretty light on the Teff. You know, this is the body that's supposed to be defending or promoting our interests, but I don't really see a lot of that. The latest bulletin from the Campaign for Social Scientists that I had really didn't say much about the Teff at all. That seems to me problematic, that the very body that's supposed to be defending our interests isn't really saying a lot about it. And of course, when you look at our membership associations, indicates that Teff figures less as a mainstream area of activity, and they continue to be fined really by research focus. This, I think, is somewhat worrying. There are examples of academic departments which in the past, and probably in the future, have come under significant scrutiny as a result of the REF outcomes. And you could see potentially in the future down the line the extent to which that might happen in the discipline Teff or not. And I think that then requires us about how we're going to respond to that. From a political studies perspective, I know that former chair of the PSA has been involved in sending letters. For example, University of Surrey, when it was threatening to close that politics department down after the last REF, we were involved in that. Well, what are we going to do on teaching assessments, or what are those sort of things? And to some extent, our mindset has been very much more focused on research, and of course, this requires a slightly different mindset in how we organise going forward. And that, of course, is somewhat influenced by what we might call applicant power. So the desire of many universities, and I think I could say this including my own, in the Teff was not necessarily about more money. I don't think that was the issue. I think it was about market positioning. I think it was about the trends over recent times, which have been focused on trying to get student numbers in. And of course that is a result of the removal of the student number control cap, and I can see that even from my own faculty, which probably has got about 1,000 more students in it today than it had maybe 3 or 4 years ago. It presents significant pressures and strains in terms of resources and delivery. But of course the reason for that is a simple one. There's no money in the system. You know, on the one hand, the government probably sees us as having quite a lot of money, being able to have, we were able to borrow, take bonds, etc., go to get the money markets. But they're doing that because really the universities have suffered quite a violent shake-up to their funding finances, both in terms of the way in which the money has dripped in, and that even includes, until I became like head of department, I didn't really have much of an idea of how university finances worked. You just get your paycheck every month and just expect it to be there. But actually the money doesn't drip into university just like in the same order of pattern that it drips into your bank account. It goes in different segments. And that requires universities to sort of be more mindful of that. But universities in the UK have relatively low endowments. Only Oxford or Cambridge are in the billions. Manchester, where we are now, is got a couple of 100 million. But if you look at the majority of them, they're sub 10 million. There's not really a significant cash flow that sits behind them. And the desire, of course, has been trying to create that extra, the money in it. And you can understand why that has happened. But for social sciences, it is also, I think, presented us with some difficult issues in relation to student numbers, because a lot of growth that's taken place probably in many universities has been in the social sciences rather than the sciences because of issues of lab constraints, technology, equipment, those type of things. It's easier literally to fill this room with another seating row. It's like being on a BA 777, isn't it? You can sort of decide to take out an extra inch and you get another 20 people in or something like that, or adjust the weight of the carpet and suddenly you save on fuel. You can somewhat play around with that a little bit. But it's true in many ways. But the recent HEA report on this did show that 72% said that a gold rating was important for future applicants to university. And I think, for universities, this is in that sense about positioning. But we also then have to think about who benefits, in all of this. The Teff is principally focused supposedly to benefit those who directly engage with FEHE, i.e. students and the wider network of support for them, by enabling them to make a more informed choice about their decision of where to study. But is that really going to be the case? And there are a lot of arguments about this, but the arguments for the Teff are pretty well worn, and they largely rest upon the fact that universities in recent years have been primarily ranked on research fronts. And this is a good opportunity, and clearly if there are people here who are gold rated, they've had many congratulatory messages from their vice-chancellors or their senior management team, and it's all good. But I think at the same time, we could also think about the fact, the way in which teaching, are we rewarding it properly, in universities? Are we rewarding it in terms of promotion? Are we providing opportunities for that? And in this sense, I don't think the Teff can be easily compared to the REF. There are a lot of debates about it, but the REF does focus on the issue of quality at the level of university assignment, and the present Teff is obviously quite blunt, and this, I guess, is where the discipline focus is going to come along down the line. But I think we have to be mindful of the potential impacts of that, which are not just positive, but potentially negative. So this, I think, leads us into also, sorry, I've slipped on there too quick, leads us also on to think about what the impacts of the Teff probably are in the short term. One is that some universities clearly are going to appeal and have started to appeal. That includes Durham, York, Liverpool, Southampton, collection of silvers and bronzes amongst them. The Vice-Chancellor of the University of Southampton has clearly been aghast at his university's rankings. But, do you not think the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Southampton is also probably phoning up those universities that have got gold and saying, how do you do it? Of course they are. Though other institutions are going to reapply, possibly. They might reapply in terms of trying to up their positioning, but they might also reapply to consolidate the positioning. So you can imagine a gold-ranked university also going again to consolidate it if they look at the metrics and say, actually, what we want to do is really get like double gold, potentially. And the third, of course, is the way in which then those institutions that are further down the rankings are going to be able to adjust quickly. And I think that is a more problematic issue because it can't be done overnight. And the metrics, in some senses, are what they are. And that, I think, is going to take a bit of time. So what about the broader impact of, there we are, I have gone forward too far, of the Teff? I think one of the things is about the rounded scholar. So I'm going to talk about 7 points here, I think. It seems to me that we're going to be increasingly difficult for us to have rounded scholars in the academic community. We already see this in the context of the REF, in the way in which choices that we take to publish in some journals rather than others. We try to apply to certain grants rather than others. We make choices about which committees to sit on, what teaching to do, those type of things. Some of those things are a matter of luck. I had a friend of mine, dad was a professor at Glasgow University, actually only died a couple of years ago. But when I was a student, went to see him, and he had a fantastic room. And I said, "This is a fantastic room you've got." And he said, yeah, I was just lucky. I turned up earlier on the day I got appointed, and that was the room I got given, and he had it then for 40 years. So now some people also make strategic decisions. I know of people who say, "I'm only going to teach final year class because it's why," and some people think it's going to be so much more difficult. Well, because it's smaller numbers, those type of things. But of course, there's also, when you look at the REF, there are parodies of that. If you are on Twitter, you can look at @ProfBritPaul_PhD. I don't know if anyone's seen that. A very humorous academic who's obviously set up a counter Twitter account to try and sort of highlight the shenanigans that often goes on. A recent post on the 12th of July went as follows: "An academic quandary, refereeing a submitted journal article that isn't very good. It does, however, include citations to my own work." And I think that's the choices, and the Teff will take us down certain choices. The choices what we make as individuals and how we behave with our colleagues. And that will create unintended consequences, I would say. We've got competition in the market in terms of salaries, and there are greater local pay differentiation. The Teff is probably going to have an impact on that. It'll have an impact in terms of people thinking about the career structure. Might think about, for example, the move away from, in America they have these 9-month careers, more fragmented structures, teaching contracts, those type of things. We already see it's quite difficult for people who are non-refable to come back into the ref, and I think in the Teff that's also true. We'll also see, I think, greater competition between departments, and also between departments and research centres. And of course this will result in, I suppose, greater playing of those stars, both in terms of retention payments that we see in the ref, and also probably towards the Teff. So I think the Teff does have a significant impact on what it means to be an academic. The second thing then is the transfer market, which I've kind of touched on. The Teff will have an impact on the academic transfer market in a way that shifts attention towards teaching, which is maybe good, away from research. But at the same time, we'll also see greater maybe attention to poaching. You know, those institutions that are bronze, they're going to come knocking on other institutions that are higher ranked up and thinking, well, how did you get that? It might be because, and they're not necessarily going to be academics. They're the key people there. They'll be the non-academics also, you know, people who drove central initiatives or corporate policies or whatever, got behind some sort of snazzy thing that the university can say goes through the whole community, which is important. In the past, justifications in that sense for higher payments were often on research. But as we well know, there's a gender pay balance on many of these things. And we could equally say an acceleration of that potentially in the Teff. So the Teff is not necessarily all good in terms of, I think, the academic market or in terms of the way in which pay will unravel in future years. A third thing is risks. If it's the transfer market, I haven't clicked fast enough. Risks. The risk, of course, when we teach, every day we go into a classroom, there's a risk. There's a risk probably me doing this today. But does the Teff drive us down a method of teaching that is risk averse? We know what we kind of need to get. How are we going to get there? Well, we go down that journey. Over recent years, we've seen changes in assessment patterns, many for the good, that have been important in providing opportunities for people, for our students to learn in different ways. But at the same time, for us, I think in the future, potentially that might make us to be more risk averse. Does teaching become more mechanical rather than innovative? Does it create a nightmarish model whereby we become squeezed into a straitjacket of what we do? And within that, and you've got these sort of performance measures, of course, you'll have greater management of that. And rather than innovation, which of course teaching excellence should be all about, we probably see maybe more cautious approaches to that potentially. And that's problematic, as it potentially lead to less development. Metrics. The Teff, I think, will focus more on metrics. And I don't mean that purely in the context of the metrics that underlie the Teff. I think that in the context of the general need to look at what we do. That already probably happens, but generally speaking, if I look at my career journey, when I started, you know, you sort of just taught. You didn't really look at, you know, where people came from or those type of things. You kind of just got a bundle of applications from students. Yes, no, you read their statements. Of course, that's now not dealt with usually by an academic, it's dealt by someone in admissions. You looked at who passed, but you didn't really look at the nature of the passes on the programs, the type of programs, those type of things. But also, what about the nature of assessment? To what extent do we have some assessments that produce lower grades rather than others? To what extent do we have some assessments who do the vice versa? In the past, those discussions have largely taken place in academic teams. But what you see now, I think, or going forward, is to what extent are those discussions going to take outside academic teams? Are you going to have people who actually talk about that and say, actually, this is the solution to your problem, potentially? And that, of course, takes away a degree of academic control. And I think that in a different way, that is also about having a negative impact, potentially, on your career and how things go forward. And that, I think, is something that we need to be careful and to voice an opinion about. Does the whole process of the Teff, in terms of how we teach students, just about getting a job? Or is it about other things? And we already see students who make choices from some backgrounds about going down certain routes rather than others. And lots of universities start to talk about, like sporting language, don't they? Marginal gains. How can we improve this a little bit more? Sort of language that would never have happened in the past. But this is a sort of thing that is the future. We're trying to outdo one another. And that, I think, has an impact on our culture. Probably stronger management of staff, I think. Stronger focus on performance. You could argue, I mean, as a professor, I used to have regular, or every year I've got one only in a few days' time, What's my performance been like over the last academic year? Has it been okay? Has it been indifferent? How am I going to be rated? And on the basis of that, do I get a pay rise? Don't I get a pay rise? Do I get slapped round the chops, so to speak? I know I previously used to work at Coventry University, and they had quite a granular approach to performance management, something called Development and Performance Review. I don't know if it's still there, those people from Coventry University. And you could be in certain boxes, and depending on all these things, you could think you're performing, but then at the end of the day, you're told you're underperforming, which is obviously marvellous to have. But I think when we look at that, of course, the Teff is going to focus on all of these things. It's going to come down to the type of culture we have. And that, I think, will place greater focus on the management of academic staff and also the management of underperformance. And that, I think, on one hand, some people say, yeah, I know that person in my department's not that, don't give them that job, don't put them on an open day, etc. And to some extent, that's accepted. But on the other hand, but they're a great teacher. But on the other hand, those sort of conversations, which largely speaking, I don't think have happened as robustly in HE as they have in other industries, but are probably going to happen. And they're going to happen. And that's going to be a culture shock for people. Some people are not going to be happy. We see themselves as being a happy club where you can roll in, roll out, do things. I know some universities are different from others, but increasingly that will result in more managed performance. And that means, of course, when we look to those universities, I see some people from Coventry which have gone up marvellously in the league table since I left, at least. But they nonetheless have got quite a focus on many of those things. And we might look to those universities as being that's the place to go to. But we have to be conscious of actually how things work in those universities. And also, as a community of scholars, I think, arguing for what we do or don't do. And largely speaking, these things have been imposed rather than debated. And I think there's a big space for us to debate that. A sixth point is about marketisation versus, I think, personalisation. We're in quite a complex issue, or complex space. On the one hand, we've got mass higher education. We're trying to deliver to that. But on the other hand, students want a personal learning experience, don't they? To some extent, it's like you want to be able to go into these big shops, but they're all quite nice. Our university is being redone, and it looks lovely. It's like going into a village market. At the end of the day, it's still a spa. But it's that whole message that you're getting into it. And I think that the point there is that to what extent are we able to give a personal education to students? They're going to ask for it. To some extent, we're going to be judged on it. But at the same time, that presents challenges for us. It's a dynamic that I think we're going to have to navigate. Seventhly is about leading. Said that rather than leadership, which is a management guru type thing. And I'm not really that. But social sciences, the Teff, I think, could bring about increasing competition rather than collaboration. And to some extent, that brings to the fore the importance of leadership or leading and the need for us to reflect, as I said before, about our membership associations, what we do. We pay our money every month to them, but do we ever actually say, are you doing the right thing? What is your main benefit? Your main benefit is probably a journal article or submission, that type of thing, going to a conference. But has anyone ever written to the professional association and say, I don't think you're giving enough attention to this? Probably not. I haven't. But those are the type of things you probably need to think about. Discussions on teaching and learning increasingly take place even on, while there's been a great development over the last decade on having teaching and learning within, I suppose, the main community, it's still actually a subdivision of that. And I think that we, as individuals and as a collective, have to actually probably do better. I sort of mentioned that before. There is, of course, the bigger politics in all of this. And I think that it's important when we put this in the context of Brexit and clearly very difficult situation. But Brexit is the biggest challenge that the UK faces, or has faced since the Second World War. The Brexit outcome was reflective of a failure, you can argue, of politics, as well as a failure in terms of the role of the expert. It was quite easy for academics to get picked off by people like Nigel Farage. You know, you could get away with £350 million a day quite easily. Of course, it's not that figure, and we might say that, and they would say, "But you would write, of course, you lefties, you would say that, whether we're left or not." But we were seen to be as part of the club. We were seen to be easy to sort of pick off, to criticise, to say that our voice wasn't important. And largely speaking, we didn't do a lot about it. We kind of just took it and got punched around the head and lost. And I think that's a problem. That's a problem. You know, have we lost our mojo, so to speak, in terms of those things? You know, and we are now in a sort of a nightmare scenario. There are a huge number of work streams, 740 different work streams dealing with Brexit in the civil service. You know, that's a massive number. It's very difficult to think of government being able to do anything else rather than Brexit over the next year or so. And of course that has an impact upon what it doesn't do and how it doesn't respond to certain things. Brexit environment, of course, challenges how we as a community work together. We as academic colleagues, you know, we've probably got academic colleagues who voted to leave. Now, I know someone who is always on a plane travelling around Europe, but you know, happy to leave the European Union. Now, you could sometimes criticise that. But at the same time, we have to be mindful of the wishes of others. Jeremy Corbyn, although I was reading the Times that Glastonbury is not so lovely as many people we think it is, because their cleaners are on 0 hours contract, so to some extent there's a bit of a blowback for him. But nonetheless, there's a bit of a moment there, you know, rock star Jeremy. And the Economist had a leader in the backup column rather, and they called him the great entrepreneur only a couple of weeks ago. And maybe we as individuals, or we as, you know, would sort of sympathise with the politics that he says. But we also have to be mindful of the finances at the same time. You know, a quarter of Labour's spending priorities were on HE. That's a significant amount of money. 9.5 billion out of 40 billion. To write off the debts, which they sort of mentioned they might do historically for student fees, is about 80 billion. Significant amounts of money. But it caught the imagination of some political parties. And we see that, you know, also in relation to pay and discussions on pay. And the Conservatives might not adopt Labour's strategy. But if they were to do so, it is not a golden panacea. It might be if you're a parent. But universities over the last decade, or the last 5 years or so, have become used to £9,000 a year, or £9,250 a year. The government is not going to spend £9,250 a year. Universities have expanded massively in terms, some have contracted, and the government is going to go back probably to student number control targets. And that will have a negative impact. You could see that if we did go down that route of redundancies, of departments under pressure. In a way that, if I compare, for example, when I went to Coventry University in 2000, I'd previously been a research fellow at Loughborough University, and it was my first sort of permanent position. I think myself and another colleague were the first people to secure permanent contracts in that department for over a decade, or it might be even 15 years. Whereas if I think in my own faculty, we've appointed probably 40 to 50 members of staff in the last year. Going and interview panels used to be a rare thing. Now they happen every week. But that has also increased the wage bill, it's increased the finances of universities have grown. But if suddenly you go the other way, that's a risk. It's also a risk when you look at the endowments that sit behind universities. There isn't really the money in the system to, you know, to shelter a university. So I think as social scientists, we have to be considerate about that. You know, we have to think about the impact of, and debate the politics, but we have to clearly also debate whether this could be a negative impact as well. It's certainly true that the fees have led to a lot of student debt, and student debt is going to not be paid off. Daniel Finkelstein was writing about that today in the Times and saying, actually, it's not really a problem. Well, maybe it's not, you could debate that, because he highlights that actually there's increased numbers at university, there's probably wider involvement of students. But what they don't necessarily forget is that the debt is going to be paid off irrespective by that community. It's not necessarily going to be paid off by me, because I'll have retired in 30 years' time, or it'll be in less money or whatever like that. You might still be paying taxes, but the burden is going to still be there, and it's going to be there for that community. So, oh, nearly there. The last thing in that sense is about the austerity, But we see from maybe a perspective of universities is that actually the last 8, 9, 10 years have been awful for many people in public service. And many people will be annoyed about the fact that they haven't had really wage increases that they wanted to have. But if you compare to arguably other elements of public service, are we in the public sector or not? But to some extent, we've done okay, largely speaking, as a job area, as an industry. And we might reflect on that in the future as a period, actually, while we've gone through this and gone, God, it's been terrible, there's been a lot of pressure, actually they were good times. You do not know the good times until you're into the bad times. I know when I was at Coventry, I had a great time, I have to say. When I was at Coventry University, did quite well, got promoted quite quickly. At the end of it, I was probably ready for a move, and I was quite moaning. It wasn't until actually you come out of it, you go, actually, that was quite good. And I think that there's an issue there. We are going into more difficult times through Brexit. Our economy is going to shrink by 5–10%. Potentially, there's going to be pressure on the Prime Minister to increase public sector pay. That will feed in probably to HE. That then means that the wage bills will increase. That will mean that there's less money in the system. Potentially then, if you were to go down, an impact on fees, that would have an impact. Which that impact might be negative. And so we might end up coming out of austerity and universities are worse in a time post-austerity than they have been in a time during austerity when they've probably survived it better than most. And that, I think, would be quite a paradoxical situation for us to face. And we also will face it in a time when our markets internationally are going to be snipped up by other places, whether that be in Australia or whether that be in continental Europe. I'm not going to talk about Erasmus and Europe and exchanges and those type of things and academic staffing. That's for another debate. But these bigger politics, I think, are areas that are worthy of discussion. And I know that while on the one hand you're talking about pedagogy and innovative and flipped classrooms and those type of things, I think we also have to be mindful of what we're not writing about. Malcolm Tite has done some very good studies, written very good papers on that, when he sort of surveyed what's been written in journals. And it's sometimes important to go and look at studies like that, where he doesn't just focus on those papers that have been written, but also the topics that have not been written about. And that, I think, is something that when you look at the selection of papers in these sort of conferences, and Ben was putting a bit of a push for future conferences, you also have to think about, actually, what are we not talking about? There's a great quote, and I'm probably going to say it wrong, but it's really, well, I've actually got two quotes. One is was a paperweight which I always have on my desk. My dad had it, and he said, "There's no substitute for brains, but silence helps," which I always think is quite good. But the other thing is to think about when it's only when we're not thinking about things. If we're all thinking the same, then we're not thinking. And to some extent, do we go down the same patterns? And actually, I think we have to think about different things and different impacts. I'm going to stop there. It was about 40 minutes. It's more than enough to hear me at 10 o'clock. So thank you.
We have about 15 or 20 minutes for questions, and we have some roving mics. So.
But if you want to just go out and get a coffee, that's absolutely fine by me.
They're not that depressed yet.
Okay.
Yeah. Questions, thoughts, observations?
Just a quick observation. I wonder what you think about Teff within the marketplace, because we've now got gold, silver, bronze. Whether we're actually going to restrict, instead of widening the market, which I think the government wanted, by having bronze, might actually reduce the market, because those who are bronze then find it harder to recruit students?
Yeah, I mean, I'd sort of written a paper and I thought I'd speak to it to some extent, but then I realised that I found today I was going to be behind like a DJ control booth, so that became more problematic. I think I'm not going to name institutions. I've named some, but hopefully positively. But I think for some universities that are in that, they're in very pinched situations. You know, a former place that I used to work at, which is now not known as it is now, has lost what 50–60% of its student numbers over 5 or 6 years, and doesn't have gold or doesn't have a silver, and that will make it difficult for them. And I think, would the government be happy for a university to collapse? Potentially, yes.
Sorry, actually, just going back to that, I'm just thinking whether also it will reduce widening participation, because actually, instead of taking students that are, we might want to get revenue, so we'll take more students. Well, actually now maybe we will take less, but we'll take stronger students who are going to stay, and then we might up our game.
Yeah, I think there are different aspects to that. I mean, there are those institutions that have got gold, and you could argue one of the reasons they've got gold is because they've taken lower intakes and they've done miracles with them. If you look at the different metrics, or not just about the Teff, but also things like the Guardian or added value. I'm also interested how Cambridge, St Andrews, Durham and Oxford do really well in added value scores. Because, surely the value is already there. But we were looking at that data recently. And other universities that you think would really be doing quite well don't. But then, yeah, I think there could be negative impacts. I think those impacts would be more negative if you had student number control targets in. On the other hand, student number control targets would protect universities that are currently probably under difficulty. I mean, there is a regional impact of the Teff, of what we haven't really talked about. In my own region, in East Midlands, there's only one university that hasn't got gold, and that's the University of Leicester, which is an interesting sort of story, whereas if you go to London, of course, it's a different picture completely.
How do you think universities that have opted out of going into Teff will be affected? Because I'm from a Welsh university, so we had the option.
Good question. I mean, I suppose there's a bit of me that wished they had gone in, because I might have got selected and got some of that money for the training assessors. Sorry, I hope that's not been recorded. I think that in time they will go down that route, and they'll be dragged down it. Unless you get to a situation which I think would be difficult to have. It's like the QEA, when the University of Edinburgh years ago just basically said, we're not doing this. But actually, suddenly, this is a standard that probably they will want to have. The problem, of course, becomes, does everyone become gold or silver? And then who sits as bronze? Those things are quite crude in that sense. It's like 2 1s first, 2 2s, we're just going through the boards. But I think for those universities, they'll survive, but they'll be influenced to go down that route.
I'd be interested in your thoughts on the approach that the Teff is requiring of competition rather than collaboration between universities. Surely on some deep philosophical and pragmatic level, it makes more sense to collaborate than to compete. Yeah,
I mean, I had sort of bits in there, but I never quite got to maybe that in the right order. I know of people that have phoned up my own university when I speak to colleagues and from some of those universities that I mentioned earlier, I won't name them, basically saying, well, how'd you get that? What can we do? type thing. And you know, there are probably some people further up the food chain who are, but yeah, that's great. And other people, don't speak to them. You know, don't give away the trade secrets, the family silver, so to speak. I think that is problematic. You know, it's problematic when you go down, if you go down a discipline route as well between departments. For us, and that comes back to what is the nature of education. What are we about sharing? Are we resources? Open, you know, on one hand, journals become all, you know, the great focus on open access, etc., like that. But on the other hand, we're sort of closing down in this area, and I think that is, because you've got something that works well in your university, it doesn't necessarily mean it will work instantly in another university. But there will always be a degree of modelling. But I think that creates us in a more competitive environment. Whether that is good for higher education, I guess, depends on whether you're sitting in a university that's doing pretty well as opposed to one that wants to do better. And of course, then the pressures that come with that. And I think that comes back to broader things. Just because someone's got a goal doesn't mean that they're not going to be focusing on other things, or that the gas is going to be taken off the foot, because it'll probably be put on even further. And I think it depends where you are secure in the marketplace. And that is a broader discussion. So for like a University of York, which is like a silver, you know...
I mean, I'm questioning the whole concept of higher education in the marketplace, which is what is at the heart of Teff.
Yes, and I think that, you know, yeah, I mean, yes, it's a competitive environment. Is that problematic? You know, on the one hand, you could say no. Or on the other hand, you could say it is highly problematic, I think. Because, you know, scholars, we should be about sharing, we're producing knowledge, we're about exchanging knowledge, we're about collaboration. That's one of the problems of Brexit, because it sort of puts like an iron curtain between us and other European countries in terms of that, in terms of funding access. And you could argue the Teff is about creating little islands. But on the other hand, you also see some regional collaboration taking place. I don't think it is going to be a hellish or completely nightmarish outcome, but I think people will strategise as a result of it.
How do you see the Teff changing in the next few years? For example, how they evaluate gold, silver and bronze? What do you think they might change next?
Now you're asking. I mean, there's one debate about what is in the Teff, you know, the metrics, and there's lots of discussions about is it right or wrong, and a lot of people have, far wiser than me, have written about that. I think that one of the things that you'll see more focus on is the provider statements, which at the time people probably thought they would be less important. In effect, you get your positive flags or whatever, and you get some positives, some negatives, and hey, you know, you press the microwave and you get a ready meal. You know, it comes out at the other end, like a cookie cruncher. Whereas the reality is that those statements took probably greater weight. I don't know, I wasn't part of those final discussions, and maybe people would have thought. And I think then, of course, is that people, because they're public documents, people will begin to model that and look at it and see what's gone into it. So there'll be some aping of that. Do you then end up with actually quite a uniform system rather than a differentiated system? I think that'll be interesting. You know, people sort of like all write with the same language. But beyond that, I'd only be guessing.
Thank you. In Ref, there are 4 stars of the publications, and you do have no stars if you are, you know, publishing a very low-ranked journal. But in Teff, you only have three ranks. So if you're already bronze, you have nothing to be, you know, dropped to. Do you think that is actually a disencouragement for those who have already gotten the bronze to work harder?
I.e. they could go down even further.
Yeah. Is there anything like nothing, no rank? You know, if they are too bad. Well,
there is, like, I suppose my physics exam, which I was very pleased when I was at school, I got what was called a non-mention. So basically, it doesn't exist in my transcript. It went off the scale. It's so bad, you know. I failed it spectacularly. You know, there are debates, and people talk about Olympic year and things like that, and whether Teff's somewhat influenced by those choice of methods. I think one of the things you need, there's a very good book by Ivor Crewe and the late Tony King called The Failures of Our Government. It's published by One World, which just highlights the stupidity of governance and government. Anything from Cohen's hotline under John Major through to NHS computer spend and those type of things. And I think that while we rationalise things out quite well in our head, what we forget is actually things are made in a spur of a moment. And you only have to go look at back in the 350 million when they had those centres of excellence in teaching awards, and we've got one at our university, and it was like a back of a fag packet type thing. Yeah, we'll do that. Sometimes these things work quite well, but sometimes they don't. I don't think there'll be people desires to have sort of a you don't actually make the Olympic trials type thing, and suddenly you're off the list. But it comes back probably to a bigger issue. HE is one of the biggest industries in the UK in terms of employment. They're important bellwether locally for local economies. Universities, they are significant employers. They have important skilled people who are generally well paid, although there are a variety of pay rates within universities. And they are important in terms of diversification of the UK, and they're an important public good. To what extent do you want to tarnish that brand? And I think that's that's a big issue about the Teff. Is it about enhancing the brand, or is it about actually potentially, in some instances, having a negative impact?
Hi. Teff is obviously metric driven, and the metrics we know vary dramatically in subjects, across different subjects. Some subjects find the metrics more challenging than others for a variety of reasons. Do you think that Teff is going to, or there's a risk that the Teff is going to be used for discipline selection within some universities, particularly those who've got bronze, and perhaps whole disciplines will be disappearing perhaps in some institutions as a result of those poor metrics?
I don't know the answer, but I've also highlighted that I'm not very good at numbers by my physics score, and I think that there is something to be said that Teff will make all of this basic. It used to be that, for example, you spoke to someone about an area. I remember conversations. You say, "Well, how's that area performing?" And people say it washes its face. This sort of thing. Basically. But actually, when you look at the numbers, you go, "Gee whiz, there's like millions or not." It doesn't wash its face. It's either making a bigger contribution than not. And of course, now we're into sort of this sort of data-drenched society. It's what you do with that. And those are choices that vice chancellors make. Just because an area is at a loss doesn't mean that you wouldn't want to invest in it, you wouldn't want to keep it, or you wouldn't want to grow it. And by and large, business schools offset costs in other areas of universities. Whether that will continue forever, who knows? I think it will put greater scrutiny and greater spotlight. But the decisions on why one university wants to go one way rather than another, that kind of depends on the DNA of the university to some extent. My own university has got quite a focus on culture, creativity, those type of things. Largely speaking, that requires space, it requires investment. But those areas also don't necessarily grow in the same numbers as, for example, putting people into an economics classroom. It's about time for coffee, is it?
It's a practical question, really. Bearing in mind the annual nature currently of Teff, is that sustainable, particularly when we move to departmental level, where the statement, which you've indicated, is likely to become more important? Whilst the metrics are available easily, press a button every year, is the pressure going to be too great on departments to reinvent themselves every year for that statement to prove whatever they're saying, which in either will support the metrics or will try to counter the metrics? I think
it's a good point. Every year you probably get these emails, who wants to be in the Guardian Awards, who wants to submit to the Times, and you think you've got a great idea, and it's only when you start thinking, where's the evidence for it? Yeah, I know that really works well, and then you start thinking, it doesn't really work that well, or only 20 people said it worked quite well. You think, actually, that's never going to win. I think that gathering evidence is complex, it's time-consuming, but on the other hand, it's quite rewarding. But it also requires academics to respond And as a head of department, I know that that is the one thing that they're generally not very good at, unless you're telling them about their workloading planning, at which point they're on your phone within about a minute. So I think it requires, we are incentivised by different things.
Yes, but my concern is that it's going to have to be, or there is going to be a pressure for it to have to feel new every year. That whatever we did last year, which supported...
I'm not necessarily... No, I don't think that's true, personally. I think that you can highlight how things develop, or you can highlight things get embedded. Who knows? But I don't think you have to reinvent the wheel every year. No one writes a new... articles are often sort of an expansion of the previous year's work. So... and that works okay on the ref.
I would like to follow up on that. Our university submission was written by our academic affairs department, and I'm sure in all the universities somebody high up wrote the submission, but when we're writing, we all write academic papers, but we're not trained in writing submissions for a different market. So I actually think that there's a skill gap in departments in writing submissions. I think we got our submission wrong. I think we didn't write it well enough. And if that's someone who's used to writing for QAA reviews, then I don't think the departments have the skills to do that.
I think it's a fair point. If you look at the submissions, some are more mechanical than others. Some you can see probably the heart of the university in them, and others are very much like a route map we've taken through. And when you read them, it's like reading essays. You know, what do you think is actually, can you actually see what is coming to life in it? But if you go back to the ref, many, what do we do for the ref? Well, you hire ref consultants. Every department is going through who's going into the ref has got a mock ref exercise. There's usually trying to get someone who's been on a panel member who's coming along to look at those papers. Impact case studies invariably went out to professional proofreaders, not to academics. Teff will probably follow a similar path, if not, has not already done so.
Almost out of time. Can you just indulge me one question? There was a political call to arms in your presentation. As social scientists, we should sort of do more. And a short but difficult question, I suppose, in some way. What does post-austerity pedagogy look like in the social sciences?
Oh, that's easy, yeah.
I'll put it another way. Should we go for the marginal gain, or should we do something else?
I think that... I think you have to think. I don't think you should. I think you can do both. You you have to be looking at the areas where you need to improve. Whether that be attainment gaps, BME, etc. They're not marginal gains. They're important issues. At the same time, you have to look at actually what is the data that's going into the system. So for example, you might have your Guardian League tables and your staff-student ratio, and you think, actually, how come we're at that number? And you probably, are you counting everyone? Some universities, don't actually look at what's going in, and largely speaking, that's because academics have, who in effect have to deal with the consequences of these things, have left the inputting of the data to others, and you have to probably take more responsibility for that. Whereas in the past, you've sort of gone, well, I do the teaching. Well, you might do the teaching, you might do the marking, but you also bear the consequences of what the scores are. I remember in the days of the QAA, the former Vice-Chancellor of Coventry, when I was there, a guy called Mike Goldstein, and there was someone else, I can't remember, Deputy Vice-Chancellor, but they kind of made it quite clear that you will like a good outcome better than a bad outcome. And I think that's a perfectly true story. And I think the more that you can do to influence the outcome, and not just take it for granted that someone else will look after your interests, is a critical thing. But that involves greater input, greater sort of chasing, etc. Thank you.
We don't close there, but if you just join one last time in thanking Alasdair for that presentation.
Thank you.